Qualys has brought together vulnerability management and patch management, letting security teams discover vulnerabilities and apply patches immediately, all within a single, unified app. Sign up for a free trial of Qualys VMDR, vulnerability management, detection, and response today at securityweekly.com/Qualys. The question is simple. Have any of the systems on my network been compromised? The answer is harder than it should be. Enter AI Hunter. Active Countermeasures has automated and streamlined techniques used by the best pen testers and threat hunters in the industry to create AI Hunter, a network threat hunting solution that does the first pass of a hunt for you to identify systems that are most likely to be compromised and scores the results on a scale from 0 to 100. You can then research those systems in depth with AI Hunter. Focus your valuable time on the systems that need your expertise with AI Hunter. Sign up for a personal demo today at securityweekly.com/ACM. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. Join us at InfoSec World 2020, June 22nd through the 24th, virtually. Security Weekly listeners save 15% off the InfoSec World main conference or World Pass. Visit securityweekly.com/ISW 2020. Click the register button to register with our discount code.
Did your voice just crack?
Yes, and when I hit my mute button just now, I coughed.
Yeah, you know what, though? It was adorable.
Hey, thanks.
Speaking of adorable.
One more announcement. Join the Security Weekly mailing list. Receive your invite to join our community Discord server. Go to securityweekly.com/subscribe and click the Join the List button. Okay, now we're ready to start the segment. Joff has joined us. Welcome, Joff.
Oh, thanks, Paul. It's good to be here. Paul dangled an amazing story in front of me, I wasn't going to be here tonight originally, but for this story, I'm going to be here. So
I read this story. I'm like, Joff has to be here to discuss this story, and I guess we should talk about it. Cisco had some vulnerabilities, and one of them was, let me see if I can get the quote from the article. Where did it go? Oh, those are lead stories. I'm looking for so an IP vulnerability affects devices from Cisco. I believe this is the same kind of series of vulnerabilities that's affecting its NX. Did I get that right? NX series routers, the big honking industrial. NXOS, routers. Yeah. But basically...
Yeah, it's the Nexus series.
The Nexus series, thank you, Joff. An attacker could cause the impacted device to decapsulate the IP in IP packet and then forward the inner packet, thus causing IP packets to bypass input access control lists on the device. I want to say this isn't the first time we've at least theorized about this attack, right? Maybe even have seen it. I'm sure it's been...
I love this. This is quintessentially straight down the same lines as double tagging with VLAN hopping.
Yes.
So, you look at generic routing encapsulation, GRE, it is IP and IP by its very definition. And, it turns out, this is going to be an amazing surprise to everybody. It turns out that routing devices that will operate at layer 3, when they see a destination address on a packet, sure as shit, they'll route it to that destination.
That's their job in life.
That's the rule. Right? That's their job.
Since the first routers were created, we called them imps, right? I mean, that was their job in life, right?
Mm-hmm. And so if you can work out a way in the routing forwarding table to populate that destination, I don't care what it is.
Right.
It is going there.
Yes.
It is going to go there.
Now, I thought GRE was really only used for VPNs, right? Because that's a logical case for it, right? But it's other use cases for GRE. They get into some pretty advancing, really cool stuff, right?
Well, so when people think about VPN, they typically think about client-to-site VPN, right? Because that is the common case that is presented to them as an employee, as a user in the industry, even as an information security professional. Client-to-site VPN is the case that 99% of the time they are actually presented with. But site-to-site VPN, it turns out, is extremely common. I mean, encapsulating IP frames in some of the transport protocol, and it can be varying. It can be MPLS, it can be IP and IP, it can be all kinds of things, is a very common thing to do. And the idea is when you get to the other end, you decapsulate the frame and you let the routers do what the routers do, right? Which is forward that frame on to where it belongs.
Is that kind of like frame relay back in the day?
I wouldn't say it's like frame relay. Frame relay was very much like a layer 2 transport, right?
Okay.
Frame relay was not an IP and IP kind of technology. Here's the interesting rub, though, and I love this because I've got an upcoming webcast on it. We are about to enter a world where IP in IP is going to be more and more present, and that's because we are entering a world where the regional internet registries have completely run out of allocatable IPv4 space. I'm not talking about IANA. IANA ran out of allocatable space in 2011. Yeah. Okay? But the regional registries that are worldwide have run out of space and are predicted in the models to completely exhaust their regional space right here in 2020. Okay? And so we will have a lot of IP and IP activity that is going to spring up to continue the operation of the IPv4 internet, as well as the transition to the IPv6 internet. We're going to have a lot of tunneling going on.
So wait, so to get around the IP exhaustion, we're tunneling IPv4 inside IPv4?
No. Certainly, because there is the reserved address spaces.
Right.
Right. And so people are still in that mode of traversing public internet and transporting RFC 1918 inside of the IP frames that are routable across the public internet. Right. But there is also 6 in 4 that is occurring. Well, so that is IPv6 inside of v4.
Okay.
Do you know anybody doing that?
Me. And others. Okay. And more to the point, it's not really there yet, but I can see an emergence of 4 in 6 as well that will come forward.
Yes.
And so encapsulating IP frames in IP frames is going to be incredibly important as this transition period goes through. And I'm going to hate this transition period personally because we're going to have more security issues in the transition period than if we could just turn the switch and go straight to IPv6. But
agreed.
I think I've kind of hijacked the conversation, the IPv6 conversation. But so these kind of vulnerabilities are worth paying attention to because tunneling technologies are going to continue to be at the forefront. Not only for site-to-site, client-to-site, and other infrastructure provider technologies, but also as we transition into v6.
Is now the time to really immerse yourself in v6, or are we already too late?
No, we're not too late. Now is the time because I think people have been lulled into a sense of complacency in that the regional providers, you look at Aaron, you look at Ripe, you look at APNIC, the regional providers have still had enough resource to continue giving out v4. That is going to end this year. And so there is going to be an immediate reaction by businesses seeking routable internet space, and the reaction is going to be, what do I do? And there really are only 2 choices. Go out to the resale market, the resaleable IPv4 market, and buy v4 on the open marketplace from other organizations, and that will continue going on for some period. Or go ahead and start adopting v6.
Right.
And I'm hoping the choice is going to be the latter because we are way overdue to adopt the technology that's actually going to carry us forward instead of trying to continue patching up this v4 space.
Here.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, though, when I think of, like, our providers here in the studio and my provider at home, they haven't assigned me an IPv6
but they
address. I mean, they will. I mean, I could probably call them and maybe get one, maybe not. I assume for the business side, I could probably get one, right? But my home one, Joff, your experience was when you called your provider, they were like, yeah, whatever. And you just ended up using like Hurricane Electric or something like that, right?
Yeah, so this was actually surprising to me, but mind you, I have a very local, regional incumbent provider that is not a major player, is not a tier 1, tier 2 kind of entity.
They're very well downstream, in other words, yeah.
Yeah, very much a downstream entity, and their response to me is, look, Joff, we just don't route IPv6, period, right now. I'm like, well, that's disappointing. Yeah, I mean, and I talked to the guy that does the BGP route tables. I mean, they don't mess.
You really got to that guy? That's awesome. That's cool, though.
Yeah, it's totally cool. Whenever I call in, and they're like, "Oh, it's you, Joff." Yeah, we're escalating, man. Just hold on.
Yeah, you're going to Dave, right? Joff and Dave are, like Dave's the exactly.
So on
totally
mine,
hold on, I just need my email password reset, man. Can you
exactly right.
On mine, they told me I have a business account at my house.
Is that Verizon or Cox?
That's Cox.
Okay.
So they told me they would assign me a routable IPv6, and I could get it just by requesting it, and I did. And then when I tried on the non-Cox, we have two. So with the non-Cox business side, we have the Cox residential side.
Yep.
The guy I was talking to said, IPv6, okay, I think that's very complicated and you probably can't understand it. And I was like, I bet I can. Try me. And he was like, well, okay, I don't know. I was like, see, you could have just said that in the first place. Right. It would have been a lot better. Would you like me to explain it to you? I've got a 30-minute lecture recorded, so you'd like to tune in. But yeah, I mean, I'm with Joff. I think now's the time to start addressing this, especially enterprise level.
Pun intended.
Yeah. But I'm a big fan.
There's going to be a huge discussion, and I hope to generate a lot of. Okay, let me back out. First of all, on June 11th, I will do a fundamentals of V6 and initial security concerns webcast, and I'm very much looking forward to it.
And Joff, so have you done the first part or not? I don't remember now from last week.
I have not. This is going to be June 11th. It's
June 11th.
Next week. Okay. I'm very, very much looking forward to it. I'm going to follow that up with a part 2 of if you are a homegrown information security professional and you want to tunnel it over V4 and deploy your own Linux box to actually experiment with V6, this is how you do it. And that's going to be the part 2. And I'm just really, really excited about it because as I dug into it, all the fear went away. I was like, look, this is totally doable. It is securable. We can do this. And we as an information security industry need to come together and get behind it and get ready to actually do it with our customers. And one of the really big discussion points we're going to have to get over is network address translation.
I was going to ask you that, Joff. So as we make this transition, right, and we all run networks in some capacity, does that mean that all of our devices have IPv6 internet routable address space, or does it still get natted at some point when it goes out on the open internet?
So the answer is, from a purist perspective, you should have a globally internet routable address. That does not mean you cannot secure it, though. Okay? Network address translation, remember, in its purest form, network address translation is fundamentally an address conservation mechanism.
Right.
And an addressing independence mechanism. But that's it. That's it in a nutshell. There is a proposal for V6, it's called NAT66, to preserve that addressing independence function, but you're more likely to be doing a many-to-many NAT rather than a many-to-one, which is common in V4.
Right. Interesting.
Okay? And I'm going to talk through some of those issues. I'm going to meet a lot of resistance and a lot of entrenched culture, but we've got to grow out of this. NAT, and Marcus would agree with me, I'm pretty sure. Marcus, I'd love to hear his opinion. NAT is an address conservation technology. It gives you marginal obscurity, but that's about it. So that's where there's going to be a lot of interesting discussion there. I'm just really looking forward to it. I've been jonesed about this. I put it together. I put together a V6 test bed. I mean, I'm just like, let's make this happen. Let's get educated. Let's do it.
And it's not that hard. I mean, it's one of those things that's so weird when you first look at it. It freaks people out. I mean, I've taught class on it for years. When people first see it, they panic, they freak out, they say, this is weird, it's different. But it's really not. You just have to get used to it. It's just like the first time you saw IPv4 and you went, wow, it's weird. And it actually makes a lot of sense. And you get to revel in massive address spaces that are just disgustingly huge at this point in time. So, yes, get on board, please.
Yeah, absolutely.
Watch Josh's podcast. If you don't know, watch this podcast so you can start getting on board.
Yeah,
So,
you
Mike?
definitely should. Look, I want people to come to the podcast. I mean the webcast. I think it's going to be huge, and I intend to do not only a follow-on. I probably do a follow-on to the follow-on. I really want to bring this forward and get this to be an active discussion in the community, and for us to stop shying away from it. It's time to engage.
Joe. I agree.
Oh,
Transitioning other stories of interest. Okay, I'll go.
I was going to say, I think Lee had a question, so I think he should go next.
Okay, Lee, you go next.
okay. I did have a question because I was reminded that back in the day where I worked, we had 4 public Class Bs and 7 Class Cs that we were using. That doesn't mean you didn't need firewalls to break it up, and you can use public on both sides. But it's an interesting change back to that because so much we've done since then is private. So I'd love to hear when you come to talk about it, I'd love to hear how that maps. And it is a mindset change.
Yeah.
And I mean, I had fun with the stories this week. I stayed away from the C19 story group, which was kind of nice. But it seems like there's people are picking up that our ransomware friends are starting to sell the data they encapsulate. And like my story number 9. And I was wondering what the rest of the group thought about that, so that, it's not just put the machine back, but now and pay for decryption key, it's pay to keep your data private.
Well,
And,
what if ransomware, and I don't even think it's a what if, is being used to fund nation state activities? What if it is, really like a revenue for that nation?
Well, it's that, but this is also just about you got Bunny Lebowski. You want to convince them to pay. You send them a toe.
Yeah.
So you cut off a toe and you send it to them. And
it's also like, you're dealing with criminals, right? So this is like triple dipping. So, at the one point I can get you to pay the ransom, right?
Yep.
Maybe then I can pay you so that I don't share your data with someone else. But again, you're doing business with a criminal, so they're going to turn around and they're going to sell your data again. So now they just monetize on that hack, like basically 3 times over. And that's essentially what's going to happen.
Yeah, but I did read it was being used to encourage people to pay because they had people were starting to. It gets around the whole. Well, we've heard about this, so now we have good backup.
And your analogy was, I'm going to send you a toe.
Yeah.
Okay, just check.
You want somebody to pay up. You send them a toe, you send them an earlobe or something, and you say, look.
How do you know that's not someone else's toe, though?
That's the whole point of the Big Lebowski. You don't, but
yes,
it could be the toe of a nihilist.
It is a Big Lebowski thing.
Yes,
have some
toe at nihilist.
yes, it is.
Well, but you want people to pay up, and if they've got good backups and they don't need to pay up, they can just do a restore because the current studies are showing that people that pay up, get the keys, end up spending even more money because now they paid a ransom and they still have to do a restore. If you can do a restore, you tell the ransomware people to go to hell. And you say, I'm not paying. I got another toe. I don't need this one. So they still want you to pay. So now you got good restores, you got good backups, and you say, well, we could restore, but are they going to release all this information?
Right.
So it serves 2 purposes beyond just the monetary one. It proves that you have a key, so you can decrypt this data, and it also encourages you not to get all your data dumped out on the internet somewhere so that people can have it.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
There was I had a ransomware story in there about RobbinHood and the Merry Men.
I saw this.
Oh, really?
The quote from the article was interesting. So there was a ransomware called RobbinHood. And the article basically declares in the beginning that even a rudimentary analysis of the malware by others at the time revealed a level of juvenile naivety that was difficult to ignore. It was littered with childish references to CoolMaker, enable shadow fucks variables, debugging messages that said done, enjoy buddy. My comment was, look, that very well could be smoke and mirrors. Like, it could have been a nation state posing as a so-called juvenile hacking group. At least if I was tasked with creating ransomware and I didn't want to know that it was from an enemy country that I was working for, I would totally mask it as I would go look for what juvenile hackers do.
Especially if you're a non-native speaker.
Yeah,
you don't even know
totally,
what this means. So
I would totally look for that and totally mirror that.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I love that right in the first paragraph of What is RobbinHood, it says, it was quickly condemned by the experts who examined it as amateur, unsophisticated, and something I could have looked at 15 years ago.
Yes.
Yeah.
Tyler.
But the bigger question, does it freaking work? I mean, who cares whether it's 15 years old or not, if that was the case?
Yeah, that's the big point is, what if this is just to do... What if they wrote this on the weekend to help fund whatever infrastructure they're using for ongoing engagement? Like we've talked before, a lot of these groups are, potentially just contracting groups working together. So they have to have a way to source some of the stuff they do. They can't steal to eat, right? So they need to be able to make some form of money as they're doing this. And even ransomware as a service, maybe they're purchasing kits or ransomware as a service. In the meantime, that stuff costs a lot of money. Maybe they're having a more sophisticated piece of ransomware and they're utilizing this lower end one to help fund the higher end one. I mean, that's how I would do it. Something you can write in a weekend to fund your ongoing operation. That seems like and not be attributed to you. That seems like a super good plan to me. I don't know.
Right. Because, your budget's going to go towards things like, I need people who understand the systems that go into nuclear reactors or centrifuges to be able to construct my next attack. And you can extrapolate that into nuclear power.
Or hardware on the internet.
Other forms of power, acquiring those systems, acquiring contractors to tell you how a water system works, to tell you how other kinds of critical infrastructure work. Because look, one of the things that amazed me when you really dig into Stuxnet in great detail is they had to understand how uranium enrichment worked, right? A great way to do that is to go find someone that understands that process, pay them a boatload of money, and be like, hey, tell us how this works. And as attackers and hackers, we know, we got to understand how it works in order to construct attacks, right? And like Tyler and others have said, they got to build infrastructure too, right? I may have to test some of this stuff. I may have to acquire devices and other systems.
And they keep retreading stuff. So this may well be pieces of really old code that somebody said, well, that worked. All we need to do is upgrade the encryption algorithm
Larry's
and it'll
point,
work again.
it works. I may pull it down from GitHub, and the code is really rough around the edges, right? But I'm like, when I tested it, it worked. So am I going to spend time making it pretty and all that stuff? No.
Who cares?
It works.
It's ransomware.
Right. In a bonus, I can use it as a cover and pass it off to a phrase we don't use very often, but a script kiddie kind of attacker, I think, is what they were trying to more eloquently say.
And it could be all of the above. I mean, it could be, there's a nation state using it, there's some script kiddies using it, and there's this hacker club in the Ukraine using it too. So
that's true, Doug. Yeah, things just end up being a tool that people use. And, and that's one of the reasons it's an interesting point that makes attribution really hard. It does.
Attribution's a bitch.
Yep.
Oh, by the way, Paul, I did start reading Countdown to Zero Day. You motivated me, and
good.
Man, it is a well-written book. I agree. I've been really impressed.
Like Kim Zetter did a fantastic job researching and writing that book, right? People like us listen to it, right? I mean, we've been covering this for the better part of 15 years, and we listen. We're like, you did your homework. Like, it makes total sense. Agreed.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's I'll say that for the listeners. Look, if you have a chance to acquire the book Countdown to Zero Day, it is a great read. And I'm only just first chapter in, but it is amazing.
I think for the more technical folks, such as us working in the field, it's a must read, right? Now, would I recommend that maybe, to my brother-in-law who understands politics but wants to learn something about cyber? Probably not. I may go to The Fifth Domain by Dick Clark or other works. But for those working in the field today with some level of technical knowledge, that's a great read. I want to talk a little bit about Apple's I think they paid out a bug bounty, but I'm not sure.
They did.
They did pay out a bug bounty,
$100,000.
$100,000.
Oh, damn.
Whoa.
Probably should have been more, in my opinion. No password required. Like, basically sign in with your Apple account and take it over. The way this worked, and you have to dig a little through some of the articles in here. Some of the research has not been fully disclosed, like exactly how you exploit this attack. Even though they've patched it, they've decided not to release some of the more technical details, which I find kind of interesting. But they said basically there's Apple is kind of like Facebook and Google, where you can use that as credentials to log into another service that's not owned by Apple, right? It works like an OpenID. And so an unexpected URL that was accessible on Apple's login servers, appleid.apple.com / and then it's redacted. He could send an email address, which you get from the original response. You can send a request to Apple servers. It'll come back with a JSON response. It's got a bunch of data in there. One of the things is the email address. You take that email address, you go to this other Apple site, and it basically says, hey, here's an authentication token that logs you in. Oh my God, that's a heinous security vulnerability. Glad they found it and fixed it responsibly, though.
Yeah, Jane released the code. I think he released the code for it on the 30th.
Did he? Okay.
So there was another story that said that he put the code out. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if Apple released it, but I think he released. I don't know how much of it's redacted, but yeah, and it did say he was paid $100,000 for discovering that problem.
It's awesome.
And it did not affect Apple accounts. It just affected the third-party accounts by giving you that authentication token that you got back when you sent the request. It was really interesting, and that was a really scary thing.
It's kind of I think a huge win for bug bounties, right? Because how do you always think that creatively about not even Apple's own systems, right? This is an integration Apple has with other companies. How do you think creatively about that whole situation and find it? Unless you have a bug bounty program and you get
people to tell you about it instead of keeping it themselves. Because in another age, this guy might have held onto this secret and been this I don't know him, but maybe he holds onto it and uses it himself for various nefarious purposes for years, and is this uber hacker guy. But now, because he can get a bunch of cash, he turns it in, not just to the general public, but he turns it into the company. He gets paid really nice money, and that big bucks is going to mean people crawl all over everything.
Again, it's a huge win for bug bounties as it gets exploits off the street, right?
Yeah.
And the street could be,
big time.
You could sell that to another nation state, or you could sell that to the U.S. government, right? There were a lot of governments that would happily pay someone for this vulnerability. A lot of hacking groups that would pay someone for this vulnerability with money they made from ransomware. We talked about in the previous story, right? That's
and they monetize it. It takes some time and resources for them to do so, but Jane dropped this and got paid for it. Didn't have to go through all the infrastructure of trying to monetize it and all this crap, and done. Huge win for everyone.
Yep, agreed. Let's see. This week's stories kind of sucked, to be honest with you.
Paul, I enjoyed your number 11 and Lee's number 7, but
were they the same?
Anyway, they were not.
I just kind of love that Paul said that, because I think that's the only reason he said, no, Joff, you gotta come, man, because I was actually gonna skip out tonight. And Paul's like, no, we got an IP story. You have to be.
Other than that one, it was a tough news week. Although everyone will appreciate my story number 11 because it's a really hilarious read. You have to go read the article. But basically, to summarize, have I been pwned breach report email, pwned an entire firm's help desk ticket system. I had to read that headline a couple of times to understand what happened. Basically, Troy put a SQL injection string in his HTML in his email, right? It's just kind of like a funny thing, right? So you can subscribe to automations for if one of your email addresses from your organization was involved in a breach, Have I Been Pwned can email you. It contains this kind of silly SQL injection string. Well, there was an open source ticketing system that this company was using that was vulnerable to SQL injection. So when it received the email, it essentially wiped out a huge database of support tickets because there was a SQL injection. And basically every ticket looked like a report from Have I Been, or had some artifact from Have I Been Pwned, right?
Yep. Yeah. So the ticketing system was GLPI.
Yes. Patch.
And it turned all of their tickets into have I been pwned?
Yep.
-- have I been pwned?
The classic.
Yes. And
I hope they had good backups.
They did.
The person that discovered this attack at the organization was kind of excited because he's like, I get to disclose maybe a 0 day to this project. And when he go to look to the project, they had released a new version and it had fixed the SQL injection vulnerability. So his advice was, our bad. We should have been better at patching our stuff. By the way, if you're running GLPI, make sure you're updated to the latest version, right?
Don't cross the streams.
Yep.
It sort of goes under the crap happens category.
Yep. And patch your stuff. I mean, there's something to be said.
Yeah, patch your shit, man.
It is sometimes we delve into this whole kind of train of discussion where like patches don't really matter, like attackers going to get in, and I believe that wholeheartedly. But we can't lose sight of that basic hygiene is to patch your stuff. And I worked in vulnerability management for 7 years, and my opinion back then and my opinion now is still the same: is don't get too hung up on priority. If especially you can easily apply a patch, like just do it. Don't get hung up in theory and risk modeling, and all that stuff is important. Don't get me wrong. I want to put that down. Like the FAIR model is really, really cool and a great model for assessing risk. But also look at like just the operational, let's just apply the patch. Like, let's not try to theorize,
right?
Yes.
Especially today, Paul, because the ease, I don't care if you're running virtualization on-prem or you're running it in the cloud, the ease of you being able to dial back like in an instant is so much better now. Yeah. There's no excuse. Just go ahead and patch it. If you have a problem, you can roll back like with the press of a button.
It's just a lot of people.
If you got a low or a medium, and you can fix it with a check of a button, or that server needs to go away, and we can back that shit up offline while it's disconnected. Then, and it maybe affects 1 or 2 users in your organization, and they might not notice for a year. So be it.
Just do
but
it. Reduce
a lot
your
of people are still stuck in that, and it's hard to break that mindset of, oh my God, we have to go through this whole waterfall model approach, because that was important for so long, and it did cause breaking everything, and nothing could be repaired. But that's not true
anymore. The mainframe kind of attitude.
It is,
right?
but I'm just saying, there's people
regression test everything.
I mean, people just remember getting burned by this stuff so many times. It's really hard for them to get into this like everything's dynamic model that we have now, where it's just like, why didn't you patch this? And they're like, I don't know, we wanted to go through a whole patch testing process.
I agree, Doug. There are definitely two different schools of thought that I'm very much kind of like conflicted about even still today, and that is the older mindset of anytime I change anything or update something or apply a patch, like bad things happen. I've been burned a million times in the past, and therefore I want to test everything before it goes into production. Fast forward to today's model, which in some areas I'm adopting, is I'm just going to keep moving forward. Like I'm going to keep patching it. And if it breaks something, I'm just going to fix it, and I'm going to keep moving forward. And they're two different schools of thought. Yeah. But I think we need to lean towards the pushing forward model, because if it's easy and you can easily fix any consequences and or roll back, like just let's push forward.
Well, I just keep telling people, be pseudo early adopters. Don't be the person that hits the button the moment it comes out, but just wait 2 hours and then check Twitter, and if something's wrong with it, you're probably going to hear about it.
No, true. I think that's right. I think you patch first.
Ask questions later.
You
patch
assess
first,
the
ask
impact.
questions. That's a great T-shirt. Patch first, ask questions later.
Exactly. You assess the impact in real time.
Yes.
If something blows up, you roll back and then you do the patch analysis. But it's kind of reverse of what people are used to doing.
I agree.
And frankly,
it's like that conversation I had with our
lower risk model.
It's that conversation I had with developer Marcin. He's like, so how much like testing are we going to do? I'm like, well, we'll push it in production, and the users will find the bugs in it, right? Like, isn't that testing? And of course, that's. I mean, in software.
Well, what I've been telling people that ask me is have a rollback plan. I mean, this is a more important aspect of this today. Is instead of having a testing plan, have a rollback plan. So just push it out and see what happens. Wait 2 hours, see if Twitter blows up. If it doesn't, then roll it out and have a plan to get back in production. You know, so what happens if this does crash everything? How do we roll back? And if you've got that, you're fine.
But oftentimes too, you don't always have to roll. Like, there's a couple of different scenarios.
You don't have to roll back. Yeah,
you don't usually. I mean, you don't always have to roll back. You may push it out and go, okay, it's good. Okay, someone found a problem. Oh wait, if I change this one thing or do this other thing, that fixes that problem, and now we're good, right? The catastrophic failures.
You may have a quick fix.
Yeah, you may have a quick fix.
But,
that patch I need to push out for this other thing will fix this. Now I get to push out 2 patches? Okay.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the but was there are these chain reaction problems where something is changed, and that patches, and that changes something else, and then that hasn't patched, and then something else changes, and there's
you need to listen to our interview on This Week on ESW with Aaron and Casey from Verica. Casey worked for Netflix, one of the pioneers in chaos engineering. Aaron worked for United Health and pioneered security chaos engineering, and it's very much along the lines of what you're talking about, Doug. It's that they're able to model in complex systems like what will break it, right? Because there's a lot more to, I'm going to make a change and then I'm going to see what breaks and what doesn't, right? It's like, well, how do you make that change? Where do you make that change, and what changes, and how much latency does it introduce between 2 components in a system that has 100 different components, and then how do they interact, right? It was a very philosophical kind of thing, I think, at this point, but it has legs to allow us to model and test exactly what we're talking about. I was talking
the other day about uniqueness, and like a graph that had uniqueness on there, and we're talking about code now, and we're talking about systems, and it was how unique is your code. So that was one axis, and the other axis was how many components that you don't control are in your code.
Yep.
So this was this other side of it, because the further it goes down that road, and it's incredibly unique, and it's got many, many, many different things being pulled into it, from all sorts of different libraries.
Right.
That's where it starts to become like, maybe we should test this, because the break could have this like crazy far-reaching thing, but you could model it. If you can model it, then you don't have that problem, because you run it in the model, just like you would on a network, and you say, what happens if I drop IPv6 in this network? You can drop that in a simulator and go, oh, it's great, it's fine.
And what I love along those lines, we were also talking with Sneak this week. Alyssa Miller came on the second segment on ESW and was talking about what else do I import in my system? And in fact, I didn't talk about my technical segment, but in the Docker file, they're pulling a Docker image. It's like it was Python 3.5, right? Docker image, which carries with it a bunch of vulnerabilities, right? But then I'm installing Nmap on top of that. Nmap then, those of us that have compiled Nmap, even if you compiled it back in the day, I need libxml, I need libssl. So I know when in a Docker image, I'm pulling in Nmap, I'm going to pull in all these dependencies. Then, by the way, I'm loading in my Python code, which the first thing I do is I copy my requirements.txt. That's loading a whole bunch of modules, which could have vulnerabilities. Those modules could import other modules, transient libraries, which then have vulnerabilities. Now my attack surface is huge. And when I get to the point as a developer, and it goes back to a conversation I had with Synopsys, right, where I'm like, okay, I'm running a Apache Tomcat version 4, and you told me it has vulnerabilities. I want to model, what if I go to the latest version of Tomcat, which is like version 7 or 8 at this point now, right? The amount of change I introduce and potential problems across my code base is 100+ tickets, right? But what if I go to like maybe the latest version of 4, which doesn't have vulnerabilities? I think it does. But what if I go to 5, right? Well, then there's maybe 10 things that I have to look at and make sure aren't things. So you know what? Let me go to 5 first, get it stable, running in production. Then let me work on my path to going to 8 or 9. And I think these kind of modeling exercises, when we look at pushing out software and patches, are extremely
But you have to visualize where you are on that graph. Are you down here in this very simple world?
Simple. I've got 5-10 things that might be impacted,
and I can easily just in my head think about it. Or is it way off on the other end of that spectrum where, it's really a three-dimensional diagram of how many things come into play here? That gets a little snakier when you just say, "I'll roll it out and see what happens." And then the other axis was how many people are using it in production.
Right.
So I got 8 million customers who are all using this in real time.
The other interesting point about vulnerabilities, right, is in this context especially, there may be vulnerabilities in the stuff that I'm importing, and we think about that as software. But I know that my code, for example, imports this library and uses this method. And Joff, you'll appreciate this in Python, right? My code uses this library in Python. I know I use this method because I know my code pretty well. And if I don't, I can go search it if I forgot, right? And I'm like, I'm not using that vulnerable method. The vulnerability is in a different method, right? But that library, let's say, imports another library which has a vulnerable method that has a remote code execution. So does my code call that library, and that library in turn call another library? Now I got to do static analysis on someone else's code to figure out if that vulnerability exists. That's where it gets complicated. And that's where I think it's exciting to talk about solutions for this, right?
Yeah, I want to make a comment on that, and actually really another point, right? And we're sort of drawing back from what we said, like immediate reaction, patch first, roll back. It's not always that simple, and I think that's what we're all saying. But I think if you look at a really good, solid application architecture, there are going to be cases where the application architecture is resistant to the vulnerability. So this goes back into
compensating controls.
Agreed.
Yep.
Yeah, it goes back into the compensating controls and really well architected solutions where you can think of maybe it's a micro architecture, whether there are micro network flows related to different Docker containers that have different Docker functions associated with the application. And when you look at that vulnerability that comes out, that is not going to impact your application because the way you're architected. Well, you don't have to patch first in that situation.
Yeah.
You can wait. You can go through the analysis of the impact because you're not going to be susceptible to an exploitation of that vulnerability given the architecture that you put together. And I like to think there are organizations that are in that position, and I think there are organizations that are in that position that they're able to do that.
But there are plenty that are not. So,
and this is again why all we see these CVSS scores and all the stuff for all these vulnerabilities is that it really needs to have some context about how your environment has been created, much to Joff's point. I mean, if you've got a really good network design or containerization with restrictive rules and some microsegmentation, this may not even be a problem. And that high vulnerability that someone's identified, CVE or CVSS, may not really even apply to your organization.
So. Yeah, and I think it's about limiting the impact, right? Yes. And one of the things I think of that we talked about in the context of this conversation is, when I run my container, for example, I don't want to run as root, largely because if someone does find a way to get shell on my box through some library, through all the vulnerabilities that we're talking about trying to remediate, right? I don't want them to be able to just install whatever tools they need to continue the attack. And doing that is a compensating control that plays into how we rate the risk score of that particular vulnerability.
And so it all ultimately rolls back to knowing your threat surface.
Right.
So if you know your threat surface and you understand it, then you can limit access to these things and you know how risky it is to put something up. So if you're running Apache Tomcat on an open web server that is exposed to the whole world, that's a pretty risky surface.
I think it comes down to reducing your attack surface, right?
No, it does. I mean,
you're going to put a lot of work into, like in one case that I've done, for example, like with Nginx, you're going to put a lot of work into making sure that runs as not root. Not because there's some imminent threat today, but because maybe that means that buys me time and reduces the impact of something that's going to come out that I don't know about in the future, which is always what we're trying to defend ourselves against.
Yeah.
So I think it speaks to like harden your shit and patch your shit
And assume everything's vulnerable.
Assume everything's vulnerable so that you've got a better time when the next vulnerability comes out or next exploit technique or technique or procedure, right?
And reducing your threat surface means increasing your time to response.
And your time to design and implement
Well, that's what I mean. Your time to response is how long do you have to deal with this after something does become known.
Right.
So if you have a 0 day is exposed and you go, but nobody can get to it.
Yes, exactly.
Then you got all the time in the world. You can sit down and say, let's decide how to put this patch in and what it will affect. But on the other hand, if it's completely wide open exposed, you're going to have to do something immediately or you're going to be hosed.
Yep.
So,
I think the element of really, really solid, good architecture, design makes a big difference in all security vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I agree.
It allows you the space to evaluate the impact, whereas those who have not got a good, solid, layered architectural design, they don't have the luxury to evaluate that impact. They have to react.
Yep.
Tyler?
That time to remediation or time to detection and then time to remediation, that delta, once there's good security architecture in place and there's good defense in depth and countermeasures in place, that allows that delta from time to detection and time to remediation to then get larger and therefore more thought out and better designed, right? You're not just sitting there trying to patch and get very, very creative in a very big hurry that may lead to other vulnerabilities. And that's one of the big things that we end up seeing is people scrambling to apply these patches and taking down a whole bunch of servers, so now they got a bad taste in their mouth and they're never going to apply, and they've got all these change regulations from a bad incident. But if you do this well with the architecture and do your network right, then your delta there for the time to detection, time to remediation can then extend a little bit further, and that allows you to do some testing maybe in a dev or a non-prod environment.
What's interesting, Tyler, what you just said is that being proactive before you know about a threat can make your time to detection to time to reaction like basically zero in the majority of cases. So the cases where you do have to scramble to do something are much less than something that you can deal with. So that being proactive is a huge part of security. I think it goes back to my conversation on neglect. The more you neglect things, the less proactive things that you're doing, and the more attack surface you have, and the more that delta between time to detect and time to react is. That's really prolific, actually.
Profound.
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 Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Cerebral.
I love it.
Right.
Thesaurus Weekly.
Right. Whew. Where do we go from there? Wow, that was
How
really
about satellite hacking?
Yes.
Yeah.
Talk about satellite hacking. Let's do it.
I mean, the story, just this guy spent, a few bucks, 270 pounds of TV equipment to eavesdrops on sensitive satellite communications, which sounded pretty cool. And then it's like, but most of this stuff's unencrypted. And I remember having a conversation with an engineer from JPL last year, and he was talking about they want to put encryption on stuff in space, but that the computers on that stuff, they're so small and so low powered because they're designed to run for frickin' ever that adding encryption to the radio stuff they're doing is like, you want it to work? You want it to do its mission still, or do you want it to be encrypted?
Yeah, this is why math is very important. This is why math is extremely important. No, I'm not joking, right?
No, I didn't think you were.
Oh, I can't wait to hear what comes next.
Here it comes.
Paul's like, I'm getting wood.
This is great.
No. So traditional crypto algorithms are based on exponentiation, right? The entire idea of public-private key cryptography is the insolvability of inversing a prime number issue, right? Inversing a prime number equation, right? Elliptic curve cryptography reduced the exponentiation down to addition. It moved into a different math set, which means that the chip cost of actually calculating a cipher algorithm that is going to be imprinted into silicon with elliptic curve cryptography is way less than it is with something like an advanced encryption standard, which is based on exponential based S boxes in the algorithm. So math really, really matters here. The elliptic curve cryptography advancement, which is several years back now, but has only just become useful, has only just become present, should I say, in commercial solutions we're using now, is actually a power saver, a computation cycle saver, and those kinds of advancements are incredibly important.
I'm so turned on right now, Joff.
I know,
I can't
Joff,
even contain myself.
You just made me moist.
You did. You did.
Damn, dude.
The big problem with satellites, though, and the thing, we've known satellites and satellite communication has been unencrypted and very vulnerable for a long time. This is nothing new, and satellite hacking in general is not, once you figure it out, has not been anything very, very complicated. The piece that we forget is, in order to do a lot of these upgrades, many of these systems are closed systems. They don't have a update firmware, right? You don't just launch something new into space and get it into orbit, and you've got, millions of dollars just to do the launch. So while we've known this, in order to fix this or change this, and many of the systems that rely on this, it's going to be a long undertaking, and one that has been going on, but for standard commercial systems that are up and running and making money, they're not going to be changing that anytime soon unless there's some serious things that come out of this.
This is a job for Space Force.
I was going to say, well, it's a great job for SpaceX, and Elon can just send astronauts into space and do hardware upgrades on all the satellites orbiting the Earth, right?
Yeah.
It's a whole new business
It's
model.
a whole new business model. Like, I want to encrypt my traffic, but I got to do a hardware upgrade of my satellite. Like, hey, Elon, can you send some astronauts up there to go do that for me? Thanks. Be awesome.
But I really hope Elon never gets embroiled in controversy, because Elon Gate could go on for a really long time.
What else is in those hardware? But you know what? Elon could take over the world. Wow. What else is in those updates and hardware and firmware on those systems that gives Elon a back door?
Mm-hmm. And they're going to use 5G on the satellites, and it's going to control everybody's brain.
That's right. He's going to go on Joe Rogan again and go like, we're controlling everybody's brain,
so
man.
Cool, man.
One thing I've come to learn is there is a metric-ass shit ton of Python code in Elon's work. So, if you're looking for a Python job, go talk to Elon.
Right.
Yep.
So does that mean that all the satellites are running Python 2.7?
Oh,
probably.
Probably.
Yeah, and speaking of Python, to Lee's article, there's a bunch of Python scripts apparently a part of this research to be released and such, that they were able to sniff this traffic in plain text, capture the traffic, and we're finding IP-based traffic, so you could capture like authentication tokens being sent over the wire. Traditional like hamster and ferret type of base attacks.
Interesting.
Oh, sweet.
It's terrifying.
Cool.
Yeah.
Lee, I think we also both mentioned the nuclear missile contractor that was hacked.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I find that interesting because many nation states play the long game, right? And I think it's easy to gloss over some of these stories, but recon is not something. I think those of us that have done pen testing or do pen testing today think of recon as a very kind of short activity, right? A couple of weeks, maybe in a couple of months. Whereas nation states and, for lack of a better term, APT groups, right? They look at this as a multi-year, maybe a decade-long engagement where I have to obtain this information. So therefore, to go to the contractor, understand how nuclear missiles work. But now think about how that plays into the geopolitical structure, right? If you can obtain data as to how to, for example, enrich uranium, create nuclear weapons, create nuclear missiles, or there's other nation states interested in who else is doing this, how are they getting that information from country A to country B, my tinfoil hat
controls the firmware that goes onto a satellite that stays up there for
right
years.
Yeah, like backdooring some of the, and it's interesting how to your point, Tyler, backdooring the supply chain, right, is the long game, right?
Yeah.
So I put a backdoor in something that may years from now be sold to an enemy country, and by the way, my backdoor allows me to mess up that process, disable that device. That kind of thing happens. I mean, that's if I'm reading about it in books and texts, and
it's what you would do. I mean, if you're sitting there, say, 30 years ago, and you are the main provider of chips to everything in the world, and you're a very long, we won't mention anybody here, but you're a very long-range thought kind of country,
right?
And you're thinking decades out, I may need this. Maybe you do build some backdoors into this stuff because you know this. You know it's going to be firmware. It's going to be sitting there. You know how the military works and that they're going to still be using this equipment 20, 25 years later. Yeah, they've got some new stuff, but they got that old stuff too. And if any advantage, if you're thinking about like war, is an advantage. And so you say, what if we built some code in here?
But on the flip side, on the defense side, though, there are ways to detect that. And in history, right, it was stuff that was being sold to Russia. It actually is in Countdown to Zero Day, I believe, where they talk about the history of some of that, how it, that was going on during the Cold War, basically, right? But that eventually, like, the Russians caught on, like, oh, this is happening, so now everything is vetted, right? So, I mean, it's a constant cat and mouse game.
It is.
It's interesting, though, because, in the commercial sector, we don't do well at all with anything that's long-term. And when I say long-term, I'm talking like anything beyond about 3 or 4 weeks. That's it. We're at.
Or even like a year, because technology to us is essentially ephemeral, right? Even when we buy physical devices, how long are they in place on our network, right?
Sometimes too long, and sometimes too long.
Yeah, and if they are, Larry, to your point, how well scrutinized is the firmware that's on those devices?
But remember,
to speak to your upcoming plug to your SANS class, right? Like, how well scrutinized is that firmware from commercial companies, right? They're going to Supermicro and buying this hardware. Does it have backdoors? And also, whose responsibility is it to look at this issue? There are some enterprise. In fact, earlier this week I had a conversation with Jen Ellis. I'm like, a lot of enterprises truly believe that it's not necessarily their responsibility to defend against nation states. The government should help in this to make sure that when big tech firms or big enterprises buy gear, that it's not backdoor. Why isn't the government helping with this issue? Why does the enterprise have to put effort and money into detecting
It was hard to conceptualize because the military moves very slow. You've got command structures that are made up of people who didn't understand it. And the military keeps stuff forever. So that tank that's cutting edge that's assigned to that unit, when it's pulled off the line because that unit got a new one, it doesn't go away. It goes to some other unit that's in another place.
It goes to the Marines? What, is that what you're saying?
Eventually.
Wow.
I see the Australian government pulled the plug on Joff, so...
Yeah, there are some organizations, though. There are some enterprise organizations that do this well, and I won't actually call them out here just for sake of conversation we had, but...
Did you say doo-doo?
Doo-doo? Did you say doo-doo?
Yes.
He did. He said doo-doo this well.
There was a pause in there.
That voodoo that you do this so well.
So, Tyler, what you're saying, some enterprises are doing a good job at this, at vetting what goes in their supply chain, basically.
All hardware that comes into, and we're not talking, we're talking like Fortune 1, within 1 to 50, that has all hardware that comes into this organization, every bit of it torn apart, looked at, analyzed, firmware checked. They have a hardware team that is, I'll argue, probably the best in the world, and they're doing this for every piece of hardware coming into the organization. That's a hard undertaking, but I have a lot more faith in kind of what they're doing with that hardware now, and where I put my bets as far as not getting backdoored.
But there's a lot of other countries that do the same thing based on the attacks that have happened between countries in the past, right? For example, when Iran brings in nuclear materials and stuff to manage that, it's highly scrutinized. Russia is the same way based on previous attacks from the Cold War, right? So because
they only have so many places to get hardware from, right?
Right, exactly. And in some sense, the larger organizations definitely have and awareness to this issue. My fear is how it trickles down to the other organizations, to that smaller contractor that's not doing that level of diligence because of the limitations on time or resources, right, that they have, but that what they're working on and implementing for the larger organizations, well, maybe goes through their process, right? But that's some of my concerns, is how it trickles out to the entire supply chain.
And
or the organizations that have a lot of money that don't have a big team or aren't doing good things. There are a lot of critical companies that run on a fairly small team that would surprise you, and that's where it gets really scary.
And now there's the issue of the gestalt, which is that it's not just a single device. It's the whole giant network where we put thermostats in the Quonset huts. Everybody's focused heavily on that aircraft, but the thermostats were where the attack came from, because all that's in the same network segment or whatever. So there's a lot to this, and it's really complex.
There's a couple things you're leaving out in your model. I mean, the article asked about whether there was any classified taken. Classified is still generally separated by the old-fashioned air gap. There's no crossing it over. And the other piece of the life cycle, we talked about inbound products. A system that's been used for classified processing, generally speaking, when it's done, it's turned into pieces the size of a grain of rice. We decommissioned a $200 million supercomputer, and essentially after we were done destroying it, we got 50 grand worth of copper out of it we resold.
Oh my God. But
for 7-8 years, about 7 years, it kicked ass. It was one of the top supercomputers in the world. We got our monies out of it, trust me. But we don't take any chances about what the work it was done on it being disclosed. That kind of stuff most people aren't aware of.
See, that as a nerd though, that really hurts me, right? Because Cray supercomputers, I've seen people turn into benches in their homes, to destroy the whole thing is okay, take the storage out of it and then shred it into rice size particles, but the rest of it, right? I mean, maybe some of the internals do have storage and firmware and that kind of thing, and I get that, right? But just the nerd in me is
firmware.
Yeah, the nerd in me is kind of.
There's a part of you that wants.
It gets me too every time. Don't think I'm callous here.
No.
I remember standing on a loading dock in Rochester, Minnesota, and there was a 650 12-way, which is an AS400. It's like the biggest AS400 they make.
Oh, I'm familiar with.
Yeah.
And I worked in retail. AS400 is very prominent.
And they were taking it to the crusher. And I was just I just sort of put my hand on it, I'm sorry, I'd take you, I'd adopt you. I know you're going to the back room now, buddy, but it's gonna be okay.
You're going to the great server room in the sky. Right?
I know. I've had those same experiences, man. I remember the Sun Borg cubes. Paul, did you ever have to put your hands on this? And
wait, is that like an E350?
Yeah,
that's
the
is
one.
What that
it's
is.
the E350, right?
The Borg.
I was like, when we decommissioned that, I was hugging it, man. I was like, oh, I don't want you to go.
Those were, I have a very emotional attachment to those systems as well. I worked very closely with those systems.
I did.
Of them.
I pulled the bus bar down on the PDP-11, so it was going to the scrapper, and it had been there for years. And they said if I was the sysop on it, and they said if you want to pull the bus bar, you can. I felt I was like the guy holding your pet while you give it the lethal injection. I was like, I'm so sorry, but I have to do this.
We do have that. This is totally off topic, but I think an awesome conversation. But we do have that kind of emotional attachment to technology that was just so well designed and served its purpose for the time. And there's, I mean, there are computer museums and things like that, and
but it's not the same.
But you've got to respect it. I mean, some of the stuff that came out was amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just. You have to respect the aesthetics, not just the technology design, but a lot of the physical design that went into these systems.
And what you use them for. What's kind of funny? You talk about the Sun E350, and I'm going to make an admission here. When MP3s were really popular, in the early 2000s, we had like stored our entire music collections on one of those systems. I mean, there were several hundred hours of listening time that we had dedicated to one of those.
They had racks of disk space available. I mean,
they were awesome.
Yeah, this was before SANs sort of the storage area networks really started appearing on the scene, and so all the disk was on board direct attached, but these guys had like shelves and shelves and shelves.
You know what's funny, John? On those E350s, there was a rectangle about yay big that you would open to access like the power and reset buttons. At one time, I had like saved just that piece of plastic that was purple and dark gray. Yeah. They were dark gray and purple, and I had saved it, and I don't know what happened to it. I wish I still had that. I don't know what happened to it. Yeah. I saved exactly the same thing. It was decommissioned. I had saved that one piece of plastic from the front cover.
Well, I used to have the tag off the PDP-11, so it had a metal tag that was put through the bus bar connector so nobody could turn it off.
Yep.
And we had to cut it. And I have it. It's probably still somewhere in the pile of stuff from my parents' house. But
you should make a necklace.
I know. I wish I could find it. I was actually looking for it last year, and when we were going through some of that stuff, and I was really wishing I could find that. I know it. Someday I'll find it.
You know what? A lot of what this conversation proves is that we're really old.
And nerds. Yeah.
And nerds. We're really old nerds.
No, it's not just that we've done a few things. I'm not going to say the word old. It's just that we're invested, you know?
Yeah.
We've been there and we've done some things that are cool. And don't be ashamed of that. It's fantastic. It is really fantastic. I mean, I'm so excited, you know, that I was involved in mainframes for a brief period of time in the early Sun Solaris and Sonos world,
but you know what's interesting, especially in today's times of the pandemic, as we push more towards cloud computing, like there isn't the same kind of ceremony when you decommission a cloud server, right?
Yeah.
Like it's a couple of commands through an API script to decommission a cloud server, right? Like there isn't this like beautiful physical computer. Right? When a lot of us come from the times when you had to build your own computer to have one in your house, right? There isn't this beautiful physical kind of thing. It is very abstract now, which is kind of sad, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
decommissioning a Docker container is not quite the same.
It's not the same thing. It's not. It really. It's like
delete.
It isn't. I had a very old. So one of the passings of time that was significant for me was when VAX VMS went away. You related to that, it's a very, very sad story, is one of my much admired system operators, which I was actually in university and ended up getting a job there, but the guy who ran VAX VMS at the university ever since inception actually passed away a couple of years ago, and I was very sad about that, but for a lot of reasons. He was a good friend, but when the VAX 11780 that we had, and then furthermore there was a VAX 8600 down the track, was decommissioned, there were people that wanted to take it home. I mean, I think one of the big impediments was actually the power requirements.
Yeah.
Fire the thing up. Right, it's not like you could run up to a 110 outlet and just plug it in, right?
No.
You know, this was a minimum 2-phase power requirement,
and one of the other sad things is that Windows very heavily borrowed from VMS.
Yeah,
that's one of the things very few people remember. The original kernel, the Windows NT kernel,
based on VMS.
Was in fact had a lot of DNA mixed up with VAX VMS. There was
did Microsoft license that, or did they hire the engine? Do you remember the story behind that?
I don't want to repeat things that are untrue. My memory is a little foggy. I believe
that's why you say "as I remember it" or "as I was told," right?
Lots of people say
they acquired the personnel, and then there may be a combination of money changed hands probably in the form of personnel and licensing, but I don't know the exact story.
I mean, and just, I mean, speaking of playing the long game, right? What if you can backdoor technology that changes hands like that did, right? Now, and the other interesting thing about VMS, and the only reason I know anything about it is because I worked for a lottery company. And when I started at the lottery company, I was like, wait a minute, what is this thing called VMS? Like, it'd come to work there, I'm like, I know SunOS, I know Solaris, I know there's this new thing at the time called Windows. I know that Linux kernel and GNU Utilities had started, GNU Utilities some time ago, right? Linux even more so. I'm like, well, what is it? BSD was around, certainly. But I'm like, what is this thing called VMS? And the engineers were like, kind of like gave me the stink eye. They were like, what do you mean you don't know about VMS? It is one of the greatest operating systems. Yeah. And as I work there, I'm like, and talk to them, I'm like, yeah, no, like, you have a real point. And then they're like, by the way, 80% of the world's lottery, this is 20 years ago, at the time, runs on VMS. Yep. And you think about the processing that goes behind lottery systems, and those of you that are like, well, lottery system, like, what's, like, every state in the U.S., in fact, 80+% of them, at least at one time, right, were running through a system that basically passed its transactions through VMS. I'm like, that's pretty amazing, because, like, you know what? I was even into security, back then, and I'm like, I haven't heard about someone hacking the lottery. I'm like, so, you know what? I'm impressed, right? Like, based on everything you told me, that's cool.
At least not that part of the lottery.
Right, exactly, exactly.
Do you remember what the difference between VMS and OpenVMS was?
I do not. And you know what's funny about that, Lee? The other part of that story is after VMS was, to Geoff's point, kind of like transitioned to Microsoft and kind of dispelled, OpenVMS stayed around for a while. And there was a brilliant engineer from Denmark whose first name was Arnie. And Arnie, if you're out there and you're listening, like, props to you, man. He was the VMS guy. If anyone in this 5,000 person company that I worked for ever had a question about VMS, Arnie was the guy, and Arnie was answering, 60+% of the questions in the VMS forums at the time, which was pretty amazing, right? And having to be able to, like, meet that person, I'm like, that's cool, dude.
So I just went back and looked briefly. I think the developers were bought by Microsoft. A lot of the original Windows NT kernel was absolutely VAX VMS at its core.
Yes, it was.
Because being on the command line of both, having the opportunity to be on the command line of both, they're pretty similar. Yeah. So, Lee, what was the difference between OpenVMS and the commercial VMS?
Well, the core difference was four things: the O, the P, the E, and the N. Yeah. It was a marketing move.
Right. It was essentially the same thing, right?
Right, because VMS required microcode in the kernel. Was the thing. It wouldn't run on. It's not like Windows. It'll run on an x86 or other CPU. It would only run on microcode kernel, a chip with the microcode in the kernel. Yeah. And the DEC Alpha had it, and the
it was specific to DEC Alpha, right? It was a different chip architecture entirely, right?
But it still had the microcode in it, so you could run VMS. They ported it to it. Mm-hmm.
And if you remember, the portable executable common object file format was designed to be multi-architecture adaptable. I mean, it ended up just being pretty much Intel and AMD, but originally DEC Alpha and other chips, PowerPC and so forth, were reflected in that architecture, so that it was adaptable to a diverse amount of hardware. So the history is actually kind of fascinating.
It is amazing to think about that
Itanium
technology.
That was the other one,
right?
The Itanium.
Itanium, right?
Yeah, I pulled that out of my ass.
That was a walk down memory lane. Wow.
I saw a YouTube video the other day. A guy was running he loaded a PDP-7 onto a Raspberry Pi.
Wow.
Oh, jeez.
Well, I can see
I'm not sure what to think of that.
But I can
was
see,
awesome.
like, the Raspberry Pi being pretty similar in compute power.
Yeah,
to
it was like he had the thing running. He was at the command line. I was like, wow, this is amazing. And I was really impressed with that. It was so cool. I don't even know why I found that. It was just like I saw this thing. It was like PDP-7 on a Raspberry Pi. I was like, what?
There was a couple of
the
books.
Raspberry 4 probably had more processing power than the PDP-7.
Oh, it did.
I agree.
Absolutely it did.
Hackers, Heroes of the Computer Revolution by Stephen Levy talks about the history of this, as well as there's another book about the history of the internet that talks about the imps and the first routers and things like that as well, that came out of basically BBN in Boston got the contract from ARPA to build the first internet, and there's a book about that as well. And if you're interested in this topic, and it very much relates to hacking. I tell you what, those early hackers at MIT, a lot of them actually, there's ties between the two works, right? They were some of the first people working for, I don't even think it was called BBN back in the day in Boston, got the contract from ARPA to build the first imps, which we now today call routers, and did the designs. And the computing infrastructure they had is very much the PDP kind of series in very early computers. So if you're interested in all of that, Stephen Levy's book is great, and I can't remember the name of the other book. There is another book. It's in my Audible account, but about the history of the internet, how the internet got created, basically. And I didn't realize how much of that ties back to basically in our backyard of Boston, right?
Yeah,
like it was
right
like
there,
BBN and the early engineers of the internet.
It was all right up
Boston.
there.
It was a Boston-based company that got the contract.
There was especially networking, there was a tremendous amount of innovation coming out of Boston at that time. I mean, certainly VAX VMS is part of that history, but networking companies, there was a very big initiative there coming out of Boston back in the 90s. I mean, there was a lot of stuff happening in New England, and it was kind of competitive for the West Coast.
And you start talking about the 90s, about revolution for networking. Late 90s, 2000, a lot of that moved to Israel.
Yeah. So the other book that I read about the history of the internet was called Where Wizards Stay Up Late, The Origins of the Internet, Katie Hafner and Matthew Lyon.
Okay.
Is the other book. Yeah. So if you're interested in that, those were really good. Good books.
Which one was that one, Paul?
It's called Where Wizards Stay Up Late, The Origins of the Internet. Yep. It's on Audible.
I have Audible credits that I need to use.
That was a good one.
Yeah, me too.
I love the way you
take a half step backwards. The founder of digital equipment, the two founders of DEC, came from MIT.
Yeah,
they did.
And so the other book was Stephen Levy, Hackers, Heroes of the Computer Revolution. I read the 25th anniversary edition. That one I actually liked better. That one was really, I mean, he gets into Captain Crunch and the whole, he gets into the gaming thing. If you can remember Sierra Online and the origins there, like that's a really good one too. Two great books. Cool. Well, with that, now that we've really, did we talk about security in the last 20 minutes of the show? It's good.
The underpinnings.
That's right. The underpinnings of security and hacking. History. Absolutely. Well, I want to thank everyone for listening and watching to this edition of Paul's Security Weekly. Larry, take us out.
Over and out.